the new God of perfection, the new gods of perfection, a new God of perfection, the new goddess of perfection, the new goddesses of perfection, a new goddess of perfection, the old God of perfection, the old gods of perfection, a old God of perfection, the old goddess of perfection, the old goddesses of perfection, a old goddess of perfection, the greater God of perfection, the greater gods of perfection, a greater God of perfection, the greater goddess of perfection, the greater goddesses of perfection, a greater goddess of perfection, the lesser God of perfection, the lesser gods of perfection, a lesser God of perfection, the lesser goddess of perfection, the lesser goddesses of perfection, a lesser goddess of perfection, the greater spirit of perfection, the greater spirits of perfection, a greater spirit of perfection, the lesser spirit of perfection, the lesser spirits of perfection, a lesser spirit of perfection, the major God of perfection, the major gods of perfection, a major God of perfection, the major goddess of perfection, the major goddesses of perfection, a major goddess of perfection, the minor God of perfection, the minor gods of perfection, a minor God of perfection, the minor goddess of perfection, the minor goddesses of perfection, a minor goddess of perfection, the superior God of perfection, the superior gods of perfection, a superior God of perfection, the superior goddess of perfection, the superior goddesses of perfection, a superior goddess of perfection, the inferior God of perfection, the inferior gods of perfection, a inferior God of perfection, the inferior goddess of perfection, the inferior goddesses of perfection, a inferior goddess of perfection, the ancestor God of perfection, the ancestor gods of perfection, a ancestor God of perfection, the ancestor goddess of perfection, the ancestor goddesses of perfection, a ancestor goddess of perfection, the ascendant God of perfection, the ascendant gods of perfection, a ascendant God of perfection, the ascendant goddess of perfection, the ascendant goddesses of perfection, a ascendant goddess of perfection, the descendant God of perfection, the descendant gods of perfection, a descendant God of perfection, the descendant goddess of perfection, the descendant goddesses of perfection, a descendant goddess of perfection, the transcendent God of perfection, the transcendent gods of perfection, a transcendent God of perfection, the transcendent goddess of perfection, the transcendent goddesses of perfection, a transcendent goddess of perfection, the future God of perfection, the future gods of perfection, a future God of perfection, the future goddess of perfection, the future goddesses of perfection, a future goddess of perfection, the present God of perfection, the present gods of perfection, a present God of perfection, the present goddess of perfection, the present goddesses of perfection, a present goddess of perfection, the past God of perfection, the past gods of perfection, a past God of perfection, the past goddess of perfection, the past goddesses of perfection, a past goddess of perfection, the God of perfection, the gods of perfection, a God of perfection, the goddess of perfection, the goddesses of perfection, a goddess of perfection, the God of sky perfection, the gods of sky perfection, a God of sky perfection, the goddess of sky perfection, the goddesses of sky perfection, a goddess of sky perfection, the God of land perfection, the gods of land perfection, a God of land perfection, the goddess of land perfection, the goddesses of land perfection, a goddess of land perfection, the God of sea perfection, the gods of sea perfection, a God of sea perfection, the goddess of sea perfection, the goddesses of sea perfection, a goddess of sea perfection, the half God of perfection, the half gods of perfection, a half God of perfection, the half goddess of perfection, the half goddesses of perfection, a half goddess of perfection, the vessel of perfection, the vessels of perfection, a vessel of perfection, the person of perfection, the persons of perfection, a person of perfection, the persona of perfection, the personas of perfection, a persona of perfection, the personage of perfection, the personages of perfection, a personage of perfection, the personality of perfection, the personalities of perfection, a personality of perfection, the personification of perfection, the personifications of perfection, a personification of perfection, the image of perfection, the images of perfection, a image of perfection, the imagination of perfection, the imaginations of perfection, a imagination of perfection, the belief of perfection, the beliefs of perfection, a belief of perfection, the thought of perfection, the thoughts of perfection, a thought of perfection, the word of perfection, the words of perfection, a word of perfection, the action of perfection, the actions of perfection, a action of perfection, the reaction of perfection, the reactions of perfection, A reaction of perfection. The situation of perfection. The situations of perfection. A situation of perfection. The circumstance of perfection. The circumstances of perfection. A circumstance of perfection. The relationship of perfection. The relationships of perfection. A relationship of perfection. The number of perfection. The numbers of perfection. A number of perfection. The formula of perfection. The formulas of perfection. A formula of perfection. The equation of perfection. The equations of perfection. A equation of perfection. The symbol of perfection. The symbols of perfection. A symbol of perfection. The color of perfection. The colors of perfection. A color of perfection. The thing of perfection. The things of perfection. A thing of perfection. The way of perfection. The ways of perfection. A way of perfection. The place of perfection. The places of perfection. A place of perfection. The time of perfection. The times of perfection. A time of perfection. The event of perfection. The events of perfection. A event of perfection. The result of perfection. The results of perfection. A result of perfection. The crown of perfection. The crowns of perfection. A crown of perfection. The perfection king. The perfection kings. The perfection kingdom. The perfection kingdoms. The perfection king's subject. The perfection king's subjects. The perfection king's dominion. The perfection king's dominions. The kingdom of perfection. The kingdoms of perfection. A kingdom of perfection. The perfection queen. The perfection queens. The perfection queendom. The perfection queendoms. The perfection queen's subject. The perfection queen's subjects. The perfection queen's dominion. The perfection queen's dominions. The queendom of perfection. The queendoms of perfection. A queendom of perfection. The perfection prince. The perfection princes. The perfection princedom. The perfection princedoms. The perfection prince's subject. The perfection prince's subjects. The perfection prince's dominion. The perfection prince's dominions. The princedom of perfection. The princedoms of perfection. A princedom of perfection. The perfection princess. The perfection princesses. The perfection princessdom. The perfection princessdoms. The perfection princess's subject. The perfection princess's subjects. The perfection princess's dominion. The perfection princess's dominions. The princessdom of perfection. The princessdoms of perfection. A princessdom of perfection. The leader of perfection. The leaders of perfection. A leader of perfection. The follower of perfection. The followers of perfection. A follower of perfection. The natural form of perfection. The natural forms of perfection. A natural form of perfection. The supernatural form of perfection. The supernatural forms of perfection. A supernatural form of perfection. The temporal form of perfection. The temporal forms of perfection. A temporal form of perfection. The spiritual form of perfection. The spiritual forms of perfection. A spiritual form of perfection. The age of perfection. The ages of perfection. A age of perfection. The awakening of perfection. The awakenings of perfection. A awakening of perfection. The realm of perfection. The realms of perfection. A realm of perfection. The dimension of perfection. The dimensions of perfection. A dimension of perfection. The purpose of perfection. The purposes of perfection. A purpose of perfection. The meaning of perfection. The meanings of perfection. A meaning of perfection. The culture of perfection. The cultures of perfection. A culture of perfection. The manifestation of perfection. The manifestations of perfection. A manifestation of perfection. The presence of perfection. The presences of perfection. A presence of perfection. The source of perfection. The sources of perfection. A source of perfection. The origin of perfection. The origins of perfection. A origin of perfection. The ancestor of perfection. The ancestors of perfection. A ancestor of perfection. The descendant of perfection. The descendants of perfection. A descendant of perfection. The lineage of perfection. The lineages of perfection. A lineage of perfection. The forefather of perfection. The forefathers of perfection. A forefather of perfection. The foremother of perfection. The foremothers of perfection. A foremother of perfection. The mask of perfection. The masks of perfection. A mask of perfection. The armor of perfection. The armors of perfection. A armor of perfection. The sword of perfection. The swords of perfection. A sword of perfection. The shield of perfection. The shields of perfection. A shield of perfection. The champion of perfection. The champions of perfection. A champion of perfection. The elemental art of perfection. The elemental arts of perfection. A elemental art of perfection. The elemental science of perfection. The elemental sciences of perfection. A elemental science of perfection. The elemental principle of perfection. The elemental principles of perfection. A elemental principle of perfection. The agent of perfection. the agents of perfection, a agent of perfection, the agency of perfection, the agencies of perfection, a agency of perfection, the amplifier of perfection, the amplifiers of perfection, a amplifier of perfection, the amplification of perfection, the amplifications of perfection, a amplification of perfection, the aura of perfection, the auras of perfection, a aura of perfection, the power of perfection, the powers of perfection, a power of perfection, the authority of perfection, the authorities of perfection, a authority of perfection, the might of perfection, the mights of perfection, a might of perfection, the dominion of perfection, the dominions of perfection, a dominion of perfection, the melody of perfection, the melodies of perfection, a melody of perfection, the rhythm of perfection, the rhythms of perfection, a rhythm of perfection, the dance of perfection, the dances of perfection, a dance of perfection, the music of perfection, the musics of perfection, a music of perfection, the lyric of perfection, the lyrics of perfection, a lyric of perfection, the song of perfection, the songs of perfection, a song of perfection, the spirit of perfection, the spirits of perfection, a spirit of perfection, the people of perfection, the peoples of perfection, a people of perfection, the mark of perfection, the marks of perfection, a mark of perfection, the promise of perfection, the promises of perfection, a promise of perfection, the vision of perfection, the visions of perfection, a vision of perfection, the language of perfection, the languages of perfection, a language of perfection, the sound of perfection, the sounds of perfection, a sound of perfection, the secret of perfection, the secrets of perfection, a secret of perfection, the intelligence of perfection, the intelligences of perfection, a intelligence of perfection, the sophistication of perfection, the sophistications of perfection, a sophistication of perfection, the genius of perfection, the geniuses of perfection, a genius of perfection, the polymath of perfection, the polymaths of perfection, a polymath of perfection, the psychic of perfection, the psychics of perfection, a psychic of perfection, the knowledge of perfection, the knowledges of perfection, a knowledge of perfection, the understanding of perfection, the understandings of perfection, a understanding of perfection, the wisdom of perfection, the wisdoms of perfection, a wisdom of perfection, the revelation of perfection, the revelations of perfection, a revelation of perfection, the fortress of perfection, the fortresses of perfection, a fortress of perfection, the city of perfection, the cities of perfection, a city of perfection, the nation of perfection, the nations of perfection, a nation of perfection, the civilization of perfection, the civilizations of perfection, a civilization of perfection,